All right, so welcome back. We're looking at the third implication of that Dewey is going to look at in his logic. Kind of the third of the kind of major implications that are going to come out. So let's dig into that. So logical forms are postulational. Postulates, postulation, that's another key term in Dewey's logic. We'll find out a little bit about what that is in a moment, so as we go along. So logical forms are postulational. So let's see. He writes, inquiry, in order to be inquiry in the complete sense, has to satisfy certain demands that are capable of formal statement. According to the view that makes a basic difference between logic and methodology, the requirements in question subsist prior to and independent of inquiry. So this is the view that Dewey is critiquing here, according to the view of some other people, that there's a basic difference between logic and methodology, right? This view that logic exists prior to and outside of inquiry rather than Dewey's view. And that this was this division between logic and methodology, and whether that's really a good distinction to make or really a useful or fundamental, I guess is maybe the right word. Whether that's really a fundamental distinction to make was discussed about 10 pages earlier on pages 12 and through 14, if you want to revisit that idea. But according to this view, upon that view, he says, they are final in themselves. Yeah, the logical requirements are final in themselves, not intrinsically postulational. And we'll find out what postulational means presently. But for now, you can kind of think of it as a suggestion for what to do, right? A suggestion, a kind of a rule to follow, or a practical rule to follow. But there's a more technical meaning, or maybe a more proper meaning than that. But upon this other view, these logical requirements are, are final, not intrinsically postulational. This conception of them is the ultimate ground of the idea that they are, making sure I'm on the right page here. So, this conception of them is the ultimate ground of the idea that they are completely and inherently a priori and are disclosed to a faculty called pure reason, which is, of course, the view that Dewey is against, this rationalistic idea that there is pure reason, which can figure out what is true irrespective of experience or inquiry, or empirical inquiry, I should say. The position here taken, so now Dewey is giving his position. The position here taken holds that they are intrinsically postulates. So logical forms are intrinsically postulates of and for inquiry, being formulations of conditions discovered in the course of inquiry itself, which further inquiries must satisfy if they are to yield warranted assertability as a consequence. Right, so remember, warranted assertability is kind of Dewey's word for knowledge or belief that we have sufficient evidence for holding. Yeah, so again, we've already talked about this quite a lot already. Logic comes out of inquiry and applies back into inquiry, and logical forms that have proved successful over time give us guidelines that we should try to meet going on, unless we find new reasons for doubting them. Anyway, continuing on, stated in terms of the means-consequence relation, they are a generalization of the nature of the means that must be employed if assertability is to be attained as an end. Right? Logical forms as generalizations drawn from successful inquiry. Certain demands have to be met by the operations that occur in the arts. So in the practical arts, which Dewey will occasionally talk about to give examples of kind of how to use forms in a practical sense. So he writes, a bridge is to be built to span a river under given conditions so that the bridge, as the consequence of the operations, will sustain certain loads. There are local conditions set by the state of the banks, etc., but there are general conditions of distance, weights, stresses and strains, changes of temperature, etc. These are the formal conditions. As such, they are demands, requirements, postulates to be fulfilled. So, for example, in building some practical thing like a bridge, there are local conditions that have to be met that are specific to that particular place. But then there's also general conditions which may not be there in the actual situation at the time that you're building. For example, being, making sure your bridge can stand up to an earthquake or something. There are certain laws or rules that you would have to follow so that your bridge maybe can withstand an earthquake, even though there may not be an earthquake happening right at that time. Maybe that place doesn't even usually get earthquakes or whatever, but there are maybe these broader general conditions that you still try to meet to make a successful bridge, a successful and long-lasting bridge. The next paragraph. A postulate is also a stipulation. To engage in an inquiry is like entering into a contract. So here's another metaphor that Dewey is going to give for understanding how logic works in relation to inquiry. So contracts. So think of it maybe as a contract. So the postulation, it commits the inquirer to observance of certain conditions. A stipulation is a statement of conditions that are agreed to in the conduct of some affair. Right? When you have stipulations in a contract, these are things that we agree to for getting something done, whether it's, loaning money or doing some kind of work or whatever. There are certain things you have to agree to. Those are stipulations, things you have to do, rules you have to follow. The stipulations, he says, the stipulations involved are at first implicit in the undertaking of inquiry. So they're not, when humans first started trying to solve problems in their world, they didn't have explicit formulations of how to do it, right? But you might, through experience, build up kind of habits of good inquiry, which were not necessarily explicitly stated. So as they are formally acknowledged or formulated, they become logical forms of various degrees of generality. So once we start making those explicit, stating those in words or in symbols, they become general to varying degrees, generally applicable. They make definite, Dewey writes, they make definite what is involved in a demand. Every demand is a request, but not every request is a postulate. He writes, for a postulate involves the assumption of responsibilities. So when you postulate something to be the case, postulate that we ought to do something in a certain way, you're assuming a responsibility to do this. The responsibilities that are assumed are stated in stipulations. They involve readiness to act in certain specified ways. On this account, postulates are not arbitrarily chosen. They present claims to be met in the sense in which a claim presents a title or has authority to receive due consideration. So again, a postulate is also a stipulation to act in a certain way, to take on certain responsibilities for what you're doing. Next paragraph. In engaging in transactions, human beings are not at first aware of the responsibilities that are implicit. For laws in the legal sense are explicit statements of what was previously only implicit in customs, namely formal recognition of duties and rights that were practically involved in acceptance of the customs. right? So you can also think of, so there's maybe another metaphor or a related metaphor of laws, right? Legalistic laws, where you start maybe with implicit rules of conduct, and then at some point you get explicit statements of laws. And so again, postulates are more like that. They're explicit statements of maybe what has habitually worked or what has proven to work in practice, but was maybe not explicitly stated. Um, yeah, I think I got to the end of that sentence. So one of the highly generalized demands to be met in inquiry is the following. So this is one kind of formal rule, one generalized demand. Quote, if anything has a certain property, and whatever has this property has a certain other property, then the thing in question has this certain other property. This logical law is a stipulation. If you are going to inquire in a way which meets the requirements of inquiry, you must proceed in a way which observes this rule, just as when you make a business contract, there are certain conditions to be fulfilled. And throughout the book, Dewey is going to avoid using logical symbols. I think you would usually see this kind of sentence in logical notation, in symbolic notation. I think it maybe doesn't matter too much. I think but I think he's giving a kind of a verbal representation of what's called a hypothetical syllogism, if I am understanding correctly. Again, not super important in this introductory material, but you can look up hypothetical syllogism. So if P then Q, if Q then R, therefore if P then R. So that's just one kind of rule of inference in logic. And if you want to do inquiry, you should, take account of these. You have a responsibility to take account of these um, rules of inference if you want to have a successful inquiry anyway. Going on to the next page. I'm going to finish up this section, which is about 1.5 more pages. So he writes, a postulate is thus neither arbitrary nor externally a priori. It is not the former because it issues from the relations of means to the end to be reached. So it's not arbitrary because you need to relate means and ends. It is not the latter, it's not a priori or external, because it is not imposed upon inquiry from without, but is an acknowledgement of that to which the undertaking of inquiry commits us. So to engage in a successful, rigorous inquiry, we're taking upon certain responsibilities. And these are not externally imposed, they're just what we need to do to ensure that our inquiry goes as well as possible. Continuing, it is empirically and temporally a priori, in the same sense in which the laws of contracts is a rule regulating in advance the making of certain kinds of business engagements. So it's, a priori in a kind of practical sense, right? In the same way that laws are kind of a priori to our actions as citizens, although of course we also make new laws and so on, but the laws come into exist at a certain time. They're a priori in some sense, but they're not ultimately a priori. So while it is derived, a postulate we're talking about. Sometimes I forget what the it is in Dewey's long paragraphs and long sentences. But going on to the last sentence in this paragraph, while a postulate is derived from what is involved in inquiries that have been successful in the past, it imposes a condition to be satisfied in future inquiries until the results of such inquiries show reason for modifying it. And now, if we've seen this basic idea a few times before, so I won't spend more time on it at the moment. Go on to the next paragraph. Terming logical forms postulates is thus, on the negative side, a way of calling attention to the fact that they are not given and imposed from without. So that's the practical reason why He's talking about logical forms as postulates, as something postulated or stipulated or given in language as a kind of rule to follow. Just as the postulates of, say, geometry are not self-evident first truths that are externally imposed, that are not, sorry, just as the postulates of, say, geometry are not self-evident first truths that are externally imposed premises, but are formulations of the conditions that have to be satisfied in procedures that deal with a certain subject matter, so with logical forms, which hold for every inquiry. So, and then there is, of course, an older view of geometry where it's, you have these maybe external or a priori conditions. Dewey is working against this tradition. And also geometry, you have these more limited formulations of conditions, formulations of the conditions that have to be satisfied. You also have these conditions that need to be satisfied in more generally across every inquiry, and logic is what applies to every kind of inquiry, not just one specific kind of inquiry, whether mathematical or chemical or physical or biological or whatever. Logic is, I think he's saying here, or one of the things he's saying here in this long sentence is that logic is kind of the most general set of rules for doing inquiry. In a contract, the agreement involved is that between the consequences of the activities of two or more parties with respect to some specified affair. An inquiry, the agreement is between the consequences of a series of inquiries. So in a contract, you have maybe two parties, two people who are making an agreement to do something, and the consequences of their activities have to agree that's the stipulation of the contract. If you complete this work, I pay you this. That's kind of the consequence. Your consequence is that the work gets done. My consequence of this is that I pay you money, or whatever the case is. In inquiry, it's kind of a similar thing, but the agreement is between the consequences of inquiries. So inquiries have to, what would be the right word here? Well, the consequences need to agree. I'll just use the word agree here. But inquiry as such is not carried on by one person rather than another. When any one person engages in it, he is committed in as far as his inquiry is genuinely such, and not an insincere bluff, to stand by the results of similar inquiries by whomever conducted. Similar in this phrase means inquiries that submit to the same conditions or postulates. So you would look at various inquiries conducted by various people, conducted as best, to the best of their abilities according to the same logical requirements, and you would expect that there would be agreement among these different inquiries. And if there's not agreement, well, that tells you something too, and you have to look and find out why, and whether that means there was some kind of error in terms of following these logical forms, or the logical forms themselves are inadequate, or whatever. Going on to the next paragraph, the postulational character of logical theory requires, accordingly, the most complete and explicit formulation that is attainable of not only the subject matter that is taken as evidential in a given inference, but also of general conditions stated in the rules and principles of inference and discourse. So we need to be explicit and clear about what the subject matter is, what it is we're actually studying, whether it's in the realm of, again, mathematics or physics or biology or psychology or astronomy or whatever. And we need to explicit about the general conditions under which we're doing the inquiry that guide the kinds of inferences we make, the kinds of discursive inferences that we make, evidential inferences, discursive inferences, and so on. And where am I up here? So a distinction, I think we're on, a distinction of matter and form is thus instituted, right? Subject matter and logical form. A distinction of matter and form is thus instituted, but it is one in which subject matter and form correspond strictly to each other. So they're not, there's a practical difference, of course, between the kind of subject matter you're investigating and the tools you use for investigating it, but they correspond, right? There's a strict correspondence. Hence, once more, postulates are not arbitrary or mere linguistic conventions. They must be such as control the determination and arrangement of subject matter with respect to achieving enduringly stable beliefs. So postulates control how we constitute the subject matter, what the subject matter is, what we take the subject matter to be, and also control the determination of arrangements of subject matter, yeah, with respect to achieving enduringly stable beliefs. So yeah, so they help us constitute what the subject matter is. Only after inquiry has proceeded for a considerable time and has hit upon methods that work successfully, is it possible to extract the postulates that are involved? So again, the postulates are not explicit at first, only after a certain amount of success has been achieved in inquiry and good habits have been built up, then you're able to reflect on it and draw out in a verbal or symbolic form what the postulates are, or what postulates are implied. They are not presuppositions at large. They are abstract in the sense that they are derived from analytic survey of the relations between methods and means in conclusions as consequences, a principle that exemplifies the meaning of rationality. And if you'll recall, rationality was discussed earlier as, matching means and ends. That was back on pages 17 and 18, if you want to revisit that. So concluding paragraph here, the postulational nature of logical theory thus agrees with what has been said about logic as progressive and operational. So we've touched on these terms as well, logic as progressive, logic as operational. Postulates, he writes, postulates alter as methods of inquiry are perfected. So progressive, right? As inquiry gets better and better, the postulates change to reflect that and to better control it in the future. The logical forms that express modern scientific inquiry are in many respects quite unlike those that formulated the procedures of Greek science. You can see a difference over time in postulation. An experimenter in the laboratory who publishes his results states the materials used, the setup of apparatus, and the procedures employed. These specifications are limited postulates, demands, and stipulations for any inquirer who wishes to test the conclusions reached. So they're operational. It's what you would need to do if you want to reach these conclusions. Generalize this performance for procedures of inquiry as such, that is, with respect to the form of every inquiry, and logical forms as postulates are the outcome. Right, so progressive and operational. Logic is progressively improved or can be progressively improved through the process of inquiry, and it's operational in the sense that it gives you guidelines to actually follow if you want to achieve something, if you want to reach successful conclusions. All right, and we'll continue on with the fourth implication in the next video.